spring conditions and after precipitation events for Enbridge, which meant that when they were sampling, what they were likely capturing in some cases was some nutrient runoff from the land surface from precipitation. While those weren't any, well, there aren't numeric water quality criteria from the band, but the nutrient concentrations were just a bit higher, but the values of the minimum values were in line with the minimum values observed from the Bad River Band and others. When we think about total nitrogen in the water body, and you remember I mentioned nitrate, nitrite, ammonia, and ammonium, we are looking here at ammonia, the concentration of a composition that is actually toxic to some organisms. The natural variability of this is about 0.02 milligrams per liter up to a maximum value about 0.22. When Enbridge went out to sample, they actually did see concentrations that were quite a bit higher than the maximum values from the historical sampling. Again, we're probably seeing situations of the very specific locations of sampling associated with the wetland areas, as well as the timing of sampling and potentially capturing runoff from the land surface. And because of the timing of the year, probably degradation of organic matter. When you take organic matter, say a leaf, and it breaks down in the water, portions of that go into nitrate, portions into nitrite, portions of that into ammonia. And remember, we're talking very specifically that ammonia does not become the predominant form in the aqueous solution until pH is above 10, which we do not see here, nor do we predict. So total nitrogen is extremely variable within and throughout the watershed. It's dependent on not only the nutrient sources, which can be natural, falling leaves during the fall and degrading in the water body actually do add nutrients to the water body, as well as anthropogenic, and that can be anything from farming and agricultural runoff to even just lawn fertilizer and other waste. Total nitrogen in the water body can actually vary based upon the timing of the day and the season, based upon primary producers in the water column as those phytoplankton and other things consume those nutrients throughout the day when they photosynthesize. Precipitation events do have the possibility of increasing nutrients to the water body throughout the day and throughout the year. And changes in primary productivity and decaying organic matter in the water body do have the ability to change nutrients not only at any given time, but as one moves downstream and there are changes throughout that water body. We're talking about nitrogen very specifically here because what we're looking at is the potential for blasting agents, specifically that low residue gelatin dynamite, that may have the possibility of increasing the nitrogen in the waterway. The gelatin dynamite is vast majority by weight is actually nitrogen containing compounds, nitrate. When one thinks about some of those horrific terrorist attacks on U.S. soil, it's nitrate fertilizers that have been used as in the form of bombs. Nitrate is the predominant form of nitrogen in gelatin dynamite, and Enbridge anticipates that there may be up to 6 miles of their 41-mile pipeline that might need to be blasted. This is a conservative estimate that maximizes the total length that could need it. Enbridge, as they've identified previously in the blasting plan, will identify the total amount of dynamite needed by each specific segment once they get out there, once they see it, once they assess it, because they want to minimize the total amount of dynamite being needed. 26 of the locations along this pipeline have gelatin dynamite adjacent to an identified water body of some kind. Only 7 of those are perennial water bodies, meaning that they're wet throughout the year. The other 19 are either ephemeral or intermittent, meaning that they might be dry at the time of blasting. There might not be water in them, so there shouldn't be the potential for nitrogen to contaminate that water body. But when you look at the estimates of the amount of dynamite being required, you use about 2.75 pounds or 1.25 kilograms of gelatin dynamite per foot or 0.3 meters of rock. When that dynamite combusts, it releases approximately 1 kilogram of nitrogen in the form of nitrogen gas per meter of rock blasted. That is a high efficiency, low residue gelatin dynamite. What I then said was, let's look at the total amount of dynamite being used. Let's try and conservatively maximize the amount of nitrogen that could get into a waterway based upon a whole list of conservative assumptions that I'm going to walk you through. So the first assumption I said is let's maximize the amount of nitrogen that could get to the water. How would that happen? Well, my high efficiency, low residue gelatin dynamite wouldn't combust completely. So I'm going to assume 20% incomplete combustion or 80% combustion. I know that's a conservatively low value because studies have shown that dynamite and specifically military grade dynamites have efficiencies of 90 to 99% efficiency, meaning there should only be between 1 and 10% residue. So I'm going to double that. I'm going to say there's going to be 20% residue. The next thing I do is I say, let's take all of that nitrogen and push it right into the water in 1 minute with the average flow rate of that river of about 2.76 cubic meters per second. Why is that conservative? Well, because remember, these are dry trenched areas and that area is going to be de-watered before this blasting occurs. So you actually shouldn't be pushing all this in the water. If one goes about and does that calculation, then the total nitrogen increase would be by a conservative maximum of about 0.3 milligrams per liter, which, based upon the average might be a 50% change. But let me walk you through this. There's a couple things we need to understand. Number one, the realistic efficiency. If you're 10% or 1% residual, that value drops to about 0.15 or 0.3 milligrams per liter. If you assume that it's a dry trench, which it would be, it actually couldn't get into the water because it's going to be in that blasted rock material that's going to be excavated by an excavator and put on the side. The next thing you need to consider is that when you excavate that blasted material and put it on the side, there are a bunch of procedures that happen as that pipe is then constructed, aggregate is put in, you then backfill with some of that excavated material, which has the potential to have some nitrogen in there, and then it's capped with the existing rock material from the water body that was removed prior to any blasting, meaning you're capping it with clean rock and clean stone. What that means is the only way you would be able to access that nitrogen with the water is through hyporheic flow, which is the flow of water from the water body itself into the sediments, down into this roughly 5-meter stretch of consolidated material, and then coming back out. That is a very slow process and does not even take place in a day, but closer to a month or more, which would therefore mean that if I took that conservatively large amount of nutrient and pushed it into that water body over the course of a day, my change in nutrients would be by about 0.0002 milligrams per liter, or over the course of a month, which is actually a more reasonable value, it's and then there's 6 zeros and a 7 milligram per liter. That is an unmeasurable change in total nitrogen, and it would be impossible to conclude that there would be any change in nutrients at the location of the blasting, or certainly 7.6 kilometers downstream, which is where the reservation boundary is. All of these measurements would likely be below detection limits. They would be extraordinarily temporary in nature because the blasting would happen. You'd see that nutrient in there, and then it would be flushed with fresh water, and there should be no effects downstream. This next section is a little bit longer, and I need to walk you through some of the complexities around sediment and the opacity of the water, that measurement of Nephelon turbidity units. So this is the one area where I think that there is the potential to see some kind of an effect, and I want to quantify that, and I want to lay out where we see those potential for effects. And this section is going to be directly related to that construction assessment that I completed a few years ago for Enbridge to talk about specifically concentrations of sediment in the water body, where you're going to see effects, and how quickly that dissipates, understanding concentration within the water column, deposition on the river bottom, and how far down you could see those potential for effects. Total suspended solids in the water column, as I mentioned before, is a measure of how much kind of rock material, how much solids is in that water. It can be clays, those fine materials. It can be sands, those bigger materials, or it could be even those, larger gravel and stone that drops out very quickly. The concentration varies from about 0 milligram per liter, that perfectly clear water. You see that under ice in low flow conditions, up to a maximum of about 1,248 milligrams per liter. That's a high concentration. That occurs during spring melt when those waters are going to be super turbulent. You're going to see lots of sediment. And it occurs after those summer storms and early fall thunderstorms where you see precipitation events causing erosion and runoff. Especially when you look at the Bad River, this is a meandering watercourse that is eroding itself. That water body is carrying large amounts of sediment on its own naturally. That's why there is the meander. That's why you're seeing these oxbows pinching off. Average concentrations of sediment in that water body throughout the watershed is about 40 milligrams per liter. Now, this is the interesting thing. When Enbridge went out there and sampled, they saw average values of about 82 to 300 milligrams per liter. That's a lot higher than historical. That's an order of magnitude for some, or more than double the baseline conditions. They saw maximum values that peaked from about 3,000 milligrams per liter up to 27,600 milligrams per liter. This is indicative of a couple things. The first is where that location of sampling took place. The second is the timing of the sampling. Was it right after a rain event? Changes in TSS are on a minute-to-minute basis in a watercourse. Think about that, right? You have really clean, pristine watercourse. There's a thunderstorm that happened. All of a sudden, now you have storm water that's going to hit that water. It can be carrying large amounts of sediment, and you can see orders of magnitude change in a matter of minutes. Okay, now you think that that runoff has happened. You've got sand in that watercourse, big turbulent mixing. You move downstream, maybe that river widens out. Now it's a little bit more quiescent, turbulent energy is lower. That sand drops out. Anybody that's been to the beach and picked up sand and sprinkled it in front of them sees it. It falls out quickly. So you're going to see changes in TSS on a minute-by-minute basis. It's extremely variable, and it's extremely dependent upon the environmental conditions and the environmental mixing within that water body. When we look at Nephelon turbidity units, which is used as an analog for TSS, right? We also have to understand, seen in that bottom left, that the transparency of the water, or the amount of opacity of the water, is not just going to be dependent on how much sediment is in the water. It's also going to be dependent on any other water quality criteria, the number of biological organisms in the water, like algae or phytoplankton, and any other substance in the water that can discolor it, like tannins and other leachates from forests. So what you're going to see is that TSS does make up a portion of the NTU signal, but it does not make up all. You do see large amounts of variability in the NTU measurements. It ranges from about 0 to 4,700 NTUs with an average value of about 67. And remember back to that last slide, Enbridge saw higher TSS values than the historical sampling. Those same exact samples returned lower than historical measurements of NTU, right? This gets back to what I was talking about earlier with not only where those samples were taken and the timing, but it was also what made up those samples. Was it fine grain materials versus large grain materials? Was it biological organisms in that water plus those materials and otherwise? So this tells you that even though TSS is doing something, NTU is not going directly hand in hand. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw your attention to the next slide, which the blue relationship, for those that have reviewed it, comes directly from my construction assessment that was completed in 2022, which looks at the measurement of turbidity and the co-located measurement of TSS. That blue line extending from the lower left to the upper right is the relationship of NTU to TSS, and the R squared, which is a measure of quote unquote goodness of fit, tells you that there was about a 0.88 relationship between the two, meaning that 88% of the variability between TSS and NTU was captured by their kind of relationships hand in hand, meaning that about 12% of that variability something else, like the amount of plankton in there. When Enbridge went out and sampled, you remember they had higher TSS values and lower NTU values. I drew the relationship between, in orange, between NTU and TSS sampling that occurred at the meander. And what you see is an R squared of 0.977. That is an incredible relationship, incredibly strong. 98% of the variability between the samples of NTU to TSS means that they're very, very closely linked. If you were to take the construction assessment line and go back to the Bad River Band's 5 NTU criteria over background, that means that their 5 NTU value means that Enbridge should not exceed a concentration of 19.3 milligrams per liter TSS within the watershed. If you look at that orange line and instead use that relationship, you're going to see that that same 5 NTU criteria over background now means that Enbridge should not exceed a value of 3.3 milligrams per liter. The conservative assessment that I did in the construction assessment actually did not just assess 19 milligrams per liter. We also assessed 1 milligram per liter, which captures even well below this 3.3 milligram per liter second relationship. We also looked at 100 and 200 milligram per liter. It also means that the assessment that I conducted previously overestimates the impacts by nearly tenfold when compared to the 2025 sampling. So that shows that the earlier assessment was highly conservative, more robust, and it does factor in, I didn't know this at the time because we hadn't done the sampling 3 years later, but it means that my conservative assessment that include 1 milligram per liter also captures this more conservative 3.3 milligram per liter assessed 5 NTU. It basically says that there's probably more fine materials in the 2025 sampling and that the 2025 sampling is not an annual relationship. But this slide should put you at ease understanding that the construction assessment that was conducted previously is going to be directly applicable to the next findings that I'm going to show you here. Remember, we sampled over 204 wetlands. There were a number of different water bodies that were sampled. Here we're looking at the NTU to TSS relationship, not just for the Bad River, but across the whole watershed. I didn't know what I was going to expect going into this, but the upper left-hand corner shows you what scientists might jokingly say is a scatter diagram. You have no relationship at all. Your R squared value is 0.0097, meaning that my NTU to TSS relationship does not have a goodness of fit. Only 1% of the variability is captured there, meaning that 99% of the amount of variability are not linked to one another. What I did is I took out those 5 outliers in the upper left-hand corner, those values basically above 300-ish, and said, look, maybe it's just these weird outlier points that mean I have no relationship. And I plotted on the right-hand side all the same exact data without the outliers. And my goodness of fit improved to 3%. That is an awful relationship. It means that the TSS to NTU relationship does not, and thinking about this a little bit more, it kind of makes sense, right? We're looking at TSS and NTU measurements in perennial water bodies, intermittent water bodies, ephemeral water bodies, stagnant water bodies in the wetlands. And when you think about how sediment is working in a water body and the time scales over which fine grain, heavier grain materials settle out, you probably shouldn't expect that. So what I'm thinking is maybe, and we haven't done this, but if you were to pull out intermittent and ephemeral water bodies, I think those probably still would have less of a great relationship, but the 24% of those water bodies that were in perennial water bodies might have a little bit of a firmer relationship. But this is the scientist in me saying we don't know. But this kind of gets me back to the so what point of the 76% of the samples are in streams with intermittent or ephemeral. Well, it means that those water bodies actually don't have water most of the year. So there's very likely not going to be any potential change in TSS in a water body that doesn't have water in it to begin with. So the other thing I wanted to capture in my understanding was how much sediment does this system carry, right? We saw the meander on one of those previous slides, and we saw those oxbows pinching off in the Bad River. And we have to have an understanding of the fine grains that are contained within the Bad River itself. Anytime there's a big rain event, you see a large brown plume extending in the Lake Superior. Why? Because that system naturally carries large amounts of sediment. So what I did is I went back to the data and I said, look, we've got monthly amounts of hourly median sediment load. I've then extrapolated this out to be what the daily median load should be, the 2-day median load, and the monthly amounts of load that should be carried naturally in the system. MT is an SI unit. It's the metric tons of sediment that's being carried within this waterway. And we see seasonal variability. And as one would expect, you see that's when the spring freshet happens and you got all this big snow melt and ice and stuff, smashing up the sediment and moving it downstream and carrying it in these high flows. You do see some lower periods as well. But overall, you're looking at 85,000 metric tons of sediment naturally moving through just the Bad River alone every year. That's kind of your large water body in this area. When we move to the next slide, we look at the White River. Still a big waterway, but kind of more on that medium size, the upper end of the medium size. When we do that same analysis, if we use the daily calculation or the monthly calculation, we still come up with about 11,500 metric tons of sediment carried naturally by the White River every year. When we say, hey, well, there's a lot of small water bodies within the watershed, and we look at something like Bear Trap Creek, a water body that I have literally jumped over myself, right? This is not a large water body. Even that small water body is carrying on the order of 1,500 metric tons of sediment every year, right? These waters are not pristine, clear, 100% transparency. They're a little bit brownish. They're carrying natural sediments. This is a natural system. There are fine grains and other materials that are getting deposited, especially in these depositional plains outside of the waterways that enter Lake Superior. But I did these calculations so that I could capture within my mind an understanding of the natural system and how much sediment it's carrying. Because as I mentioned, this is a construction-related project. Enbridge Line 5, you're bringing out the excavators, you're trenching an area, you're going to add sediment to the water. And I want to see how much sediment could get in the water. And then we look at the turbidity measurements of trenched crossings. And when we look in the upper left-hand corner, for a small watercourse where you go in, you add the aqua dams, you excavate the material, you spend about 20 hours during construction, we anticipate that there's a conservative maximum of about 3/4 of a metric ton. When you look at a medium watercourse, there's as much as 5.6 metric tons total from that waterway that could get their way into the water. If you look up at the top right, those are very, very small numbers when we look at, for a small watercourse, 0.75 metric tons versus 1,545 metric tons. There is a very small number, 5.62 metric tons for your medium watercourse, and your White River is your medium analog, which is carrying 11,422 metric tons per year. So while we understand that sediment load is extremely variable, we also need to understand TSS is the scientific international unit, the SI unit of measure for amount of sediment in a water body. And the NTU is really not a great analog, and we've seen that there's a lot of noise in there. We can say that the sediment load from these construction activities are small in relation to the annual average, and they can be substantial to some level for small and medium water courses based upon the 2-day sediment load. So that what I mean by that is, if you were to disturb 0.75 metric tons in a small water course, that could be 35% of your 2-day load, up to 75-fold of your sediment load in a very small water course, depending on the flow rate. For your medium water course, for your 2-day average, you could be kind of changing the amount of sediment carried in that medium waterway by about 2.2% up to 32% during that 2-day period. So what am I saying? I am saying that there are measurable changes in TSS with exceedances that might last 4 to 10 hours during the construction phase in waters, this is the key, upstream of the reservation, but certainly none within the reservation, because when you look at this and you relate this back to the modeling that I conducted, You should see hundreds of milligram per liter exceedances possible at the release location, but as those sediments drop out of the water column, you're going to see that first criteria, 19.3 milligrams per liter, kind of being met by 700 meters downstream for a small watercourse or 100 meters downstream for your medium watercourse. And you'll drop below that even more conservative value of 1 milligram per liter in all the modeled scenarios by 1 kilometer for a small watercourse or 500 meters for a medium watercourse. All trenching activities are going to take place greater than 2 kilometers, meaning you are going to be well below 1 milligram per liter at 1 kilometer, a full kilometer upstream of the reservation boundary. So I don't think it's possible to conclude that there would be effects within the reservation based upon what we're seeing here. I then think about inadvertent returns, and Joe and Ray talked a little bit about inadvertent returns that did occur on line 3. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to capture a little bit of an understanding of, well, okay, you've told me that there were inadvertent returns. What was the total amount of drilling fluids that came out? And to the right of that table, you're going to see that the average sediment released from inadvertent returns associated with the line 3 construction was about 20.4 kilograms, kgs. That's about 0.00204 metric tons of sodium bentonite entering those watercourses during the actual inadvertent returns associated with line 3. The average was about 450 gallons of fluid total. So what I'm doing here in the upper left is looking at a 5.5 metric ton release from an inadvertent return and an 11 metric ton release from an inadvertent return. This is a full 5 orders of magnitude greater than the actual inadvertent returns seen on line 3. Why am I doing this? My job, I told you, I'm here to be the impartial scientist, is to try and conservatively maximize the potential for effects so that I can say either it's possible or it's not possible for there to be effects associated with these activities. We've seen sediment load is extremely variable. We've seen that based upon real life activities versus the conservative approximations where I'm going to maximize the flow rate of sodium bentonite, I'm going to maximize the volume entering the water body, I'm going to maximize the total mass of sediment entering the water body, that on average, that would mean you'd have a 4.8 to a 39% increase in the 2-day median load for the Bad River. You'd see about a 4.3 to an 87% increase in the 2-day median load for the White River, and a 2.8 to 380-fold increase for the small watercourse. This just makes sense, right? When you're looking at a small watercourse and you put 11 metric tons of sediment, it's going to be a lot more than the total sediment load for that. But you have to then take into consideration that those red numbers are based on these highly conservative values that are actually 5 orders of magnitude conservative based upon what we actually saw for line 3. Based upon these conservative approximations, I do think that there is the possibility for measurable changes in TSS associated with inadvertent returns. Those exceedances would last on the order of hours in the upstream waters above the reservation, but none in the reservation. Because when you look at this and when you look at the dispersion, when you look at the dilution, when you look at the settling of those sediments within the water body, yes, you might start with greater than 20,000 milligrams per liter at the release location. That's going to drop pretty quickly to 10 to 300 milligrams per liter by 500 meters downstream. It's going to drop to about that 19.3 first criteria by about 1 kilometer downstream. And you're going to be less than 1 milligram per liter in all modeled scenarios by about 2 kilometers downstream. All the HDD activities take place greater than 2 kilometers upstream of the reservation boundary. So based upon the data, I don't think it's possible to conclude that there would be the potential for effects within the reservation. So what you've seen here is I've walked you through each of the different numeric criteria. I've walked you through changes in pH, total nitrogen, ammonia. Each of these different criteria, I don't see there being the possibility of having any sort of a threshold exceedance within the reservation. I don't think the data is there to be able to conclude that. I've showed you that while there could be the potential for exceedances in TSS in upstream waters, based upon the sediment dispersion modeling that I've conducted and based upon an analysis of the sediment loads within these different water bodies, it's not possible to conclude that you would have any sort of an exceedance at the reservation boundary or within the reservation boundary based upon the modeling that we've conducted. So with that, do you want to do a wrap up, or I think we've...
Yeah, we can do a wrap up.
Yeah.
I mean, we'll do the presentation. We these water quality, measurable water quality impacts on the Bad River Reservation, and we covered the items we said, and I think we stated or approved that point. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Enbridge team. We're going to take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 10:30 to start with the Bad River.
Do you agree?
It's a great hard drive.
For those participating online, we're going to do a slight technical difficulty. We're going to take about 10 minutes to try to troubleshoot, provide an update approximately 10:42. Thanks. Audio check from anybody online.
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Thanks. Okay, we're going to start with the Bad River Band's testimony. We're going to proceed for roughly an hour and a half. We'll find a natural breaking point around noon, and then proceed again after the hour-long break. With that, turn it over to Bad River.
Thank you very much. My name is Connie Sue Martin. I am an environmental attorney. Attorneys don't usually do their years in service, but the engineers all did it. So I will tell you, I have been practicing law for 27 years. For almost all of those 27 years, I have practiced environmental and natural resources law and represented Indian tribes like the Bad River Band. I have been the Bad River Band's outside counsel in environmental matters since about 2012. The Clean Water Act 401 certification process has two separate independent steps. The first is the state in which a discharge will occur certifies that, subject to conditions, the project, if permitted, will not violate that state's or tribe's water quality standards. The separate second independent step is a neighboring jurisdiction, like the Bad River Band, determines whether or not that permitted discharge would violate its water quality standards or water quality requirements. Water quality requirements are defined under the statute as limitations or standards under the Federal Clean Water Act, specific sections, as well as any federal, state, or tribal laws or regulations or standards. Water quality standards, in turn, consist of three core components: designated uses of a water body, criteria to protect those designated uses, which can be either numeric or narrative, including water flow or volume, and anti-degradation requirements to protect the existing uses and high-quality, high-value waters. Dr. Horn characterized the narrative standards as loose. They are not. Each of those three standards are equally important under the Clean Water Act. Tribes such as the Bad River Band, with treatment in a similar manner as a state or TAS designation for Section 401, are accorded the neighboring jurisdiction authority for purposes of 401A2. And the Bad River Band is indeed a neighboring jurisdiction under the Act, which is why we are here. Under the Act, under this process, the second step, if a neighboring jurisdiction determines that discharges will violate its water quality requirements, the licensing or permitting agency, here the Corps, must condition that relevant permit as may be necessary to ensure compliance with applicable water quality requirements based upon the recommendations of the EPA, the neighboring jurisdiction, and at a hearing, any additional relevant testimony presented. If the imposition of conditions cannot ensure that water quality requirements will not be violated, the permit shall not issue. The regulations implementing Section 401 are clear that the state of Wisconsin, as the certifying entity in the first step, has no role in the will effect process under 401A2. It's worth noting, however, that in order to certify that this project wouldn't violate the state of Wisconsin's water quality standards, the state imposed 231 conditions on this project. Consider the implications of that. There's 231 conditions that are required in order for the project to comply, meaning if you don't comply with all 231, if you just miss one of them, then you're not satisfying the state of Wisconsin's water quality standards. Wisconsin didn't consider the band's water quality standards. The regulations don't comply, or excuse me, don't require it. It's not contemplated because it's the neighboring jurisdiction's job to figure that out. But what it means, because Wisconsin didn't consider the band's water quality standards, is that even with all 231 of those requirements, those conditions, they will satisfy Wisconsin's water quality standards, but not the more protective standards adopted by the band. The EPA has provided an overview of its role in this 401A2 process. Following its initial determination that the project may affect the band's water quality requirements, the band then submitted its determination that the project's discharges will affect the quality of the band's waters so as to violate the band's water quality requirements. And the band objected to the issuance of the permit and requested this hearing. The band is the expert on the application and enforcement of its own water quality standards, not the EPA. Just as the state of Wisconsin, in issuing its certification under the first step of this process, is the expert on its water quality standards. The tribe's TAS authority means that it is the authority on promulgating and enforcing its standards. And in order to be able to enforce a standard, the Clean Water Act recognizes that the authority has to identify what is or may be a violation of its standards, which the band has done here. The EPA's role is to evaluate the band's objection and provide the Corps with its recommendation. Dispositive. The Corps must consider those recommendations, the band's recommendations, and the additional evidence that will be presented at this hearing, including the information that was provided to the EPA that it did not consider before rendering its recommendations. The EPA's job in this process is not to determine whether the project will violate the band's water quality standards, because the band has already determined that. What EPA is trying to explain is that the additional conditions, there are conditions that can be added, or there need not be additional conditions on top of the 231 that the state of Wisconsin has imposed. The information and analysis in the band's will effect letter and the additional evidence you will hear today lead to only one conclusion. There are no conditions that can be imposed on the project as designed that will ensure compliance with the band's water quality standards. As you will hear today and probably tomorrow from the band's witnesses, the hydrology of the watershed was not fully understood by the applicant or the Corps in assessing its impacts. It is actually far more connected and denser, with much more wetlands that were initially identified. You'll hear that from Mr. Chiriboga. The construction best management practices do not and cannot prevent the discharge of all pollutants into wetlands and waters that flow into the band's reservation. They are not designed to do so. So even if they are constructed perfectly and implemented and maintained perfectly, they do not prevent the discharge of pollutants. The construction means and methods cause short-term, long-term, and permanent impacts to the hydrology, the groundwater, the surface water, and the wetlands of the Bad River watershed. The impacts and changes to the wetlands will increase mercury and methylmercury releases into an already mercury impaired environment on the reservation, just as was the case in the Fond du Lac Band's project. The conclusion that no conditions can be imposed that will prevent the violation of the band's water quality requirements in turn leads to only one possible outcome under the Clean Water Act. The Corps cannot issue the permit. If the imposition of conditions cannot ensure such compliance, such agency shall not issue such license or permit. The band's first witnesses this morning are its chairman, the Honorable Robert Blanchard, its treasurer and council member, Patty Navieu, followed by a presentation by Chris McNerney, the Water Resources Program Manager for the band's Natural Resources Department, and Esteban Chiriboga from Gliffwick. Mr. Chairman.
Bonjour, Anamake Ogama Ndigo, Mishkazibi, Nilunjiba, Makwa Tudem. I introduce myself in my native language, which means leader of the Thunderbirds. My home is the Bad River Reservation, also known as Medicine River. Bad River is. I am of the Bear Clan. My English name is Robert Blanchard. I'm chairman of the Bad River Tribe. And I want to thank you to Colonel Swenson and Lieutenant Colonel Rudd for allowing the Bad River Band to present testimony in person rather than virtual. As I referenced in our phone conversation a few weeks ago, it is important to the people of Bad River that we speak of our homelands face to face. With that said, I would like to talk to you about our home, but first let me say that it is difficult for me to put into words, much less putting pen to paper, unless one lives the life on the reservation where we must use our natural resources to provide for our families. It is very hard to explain so that one can visualize how we survived over the years. We have resided for hundreds of years and will for hundreds of years into the future. Born and raised on a reservation, leaving only for short periods for school and military, I was raised by my grandparents on my mother's side. I grew up learning from my grandfather. He taught me to hunt, fish, and gather. Many of the medicinal medicines which I still gather and use today for the healing of my relatives and friends that want it. So you see, when I look at my homelands, I see it through the eyes of my grandfather, who's seen it through the eyes of his grandfather. It is now my duty as a grandfather to make sure that my grandchildren and great-grandchildren see it through my eyes. I first harvested wild rice under the watchful eye of my grandfather. I harvested and taught my sons and daughter the proper way to harvest. In turn, they will teach their children. As I grow older, I had to feed and provide for my family through hunting, fishing, and gathering. In later years, I formed a relationship with my father. I've learned from him and two other elders how to fish the depths of Lake Superior. Every spring for many years, we would travel the Bad River out to the shores of Lake Superior, where we would set up a fish camp. There we would harvest fish. Some would take to market, some would go to the freezer to feed family, and some of the harvest would benefit friends and relatives by sharing a harvest with those that did not have the ability to harvest or could not harvest due to age or handicap. It has been on the receiving end of clear cutting of our timbers for many years, going back to the early 1900s. I remember my grandparents telling me stories of lumber company known as Stearns Lumber that made their way onto the reservation. They clear cut most of the virgin timber on the reserve. After all the marketable timber was cut, they packed up and left. Clear cutting of our timbers allows runoff to degrade our rivers and streams. The dumping of sludge from a paper mill also went on for many years and infiltrated our groundwater, which we drank for years. Cancer became more and more prevalent in my community. My wife and mother of our children, and my mother, the grandmother of my children, both have passed on due to cancer and both lived in the area of the dump site for many years. This was all within the Bad River watershed. Our dependence for survival is water. Having the clean, clear water necessary to sustain the natural environment necessary for all living things in which we depend on for family. In my youth, my grandfather showed me a couple of special places on the reservation. I remember it like it was yesterday. The story he told me of the water that comes from beneath the earth, cold and clear. And I was supposed to have a video here, but it got corrupted, I guess, within the. But this is the headwaters of a place known as Winks Creek, a place where brook trout live. This creek flows into Potato River, which flows into the Bad River and eventually makes its way out to Lake Superior. I drank the waters from this spring. He told me we will always have the need for clean water so that we will not become sick. Recently, I went in search of these places and was able to find that one place. It's still running clear and cold to this day. I do think it is still pure as the day he showed it to me. In 1984, the Ojibwe signed a treaty with the U.S. government and ceded millions of acres of land in exchange for many things, including the right to hunt and fish and gather in the ceded lands. This is why I'm here in front of you today to speak for our waters, for all the things that require clean water in which to live, the natural medicines that grow. We believe, as Anishinaabe, we believe every living plant or animal has a spirit. Even the water has spirit. Whatever happens upstream from our reservation will affect the waters that we and many others depend on for survival. By permitting the entity to harm the sensitive ecosystem will cause irreparable harm to our territories. It will affect the very waters that give us all life. It will affect all living things, not only for the Anishinaabe, but for everyone in the region and beyond. So I ask, when the time comes to make a decision to either deny or grant these permits, think of the people it will affect. Think of our Mother Earth and all living things that will be destroyed. So today and tomorrow you will hear details on how, if granted, permits will affect our waters. Thank you. Turn it over to Patty.
Bonjour. My name is Patty Neville, and I am a Bad River tribal member and currently serve on the tribal council as treasurer. I want to thank the Army Corps of Engineers for holding this public hearing on this crucial matter, the Clean Water Act 401A2. The Bad River tribe has expressed its objection under the Clean Water Act section 401A2 to issue a permit to Enbridge to proceed. There are over 57 tributaries running into the Bad River. The project has the potential to impact over 100 acres of wetland. And furthermore, blasting south of the reservation will affect our tribal waters. By no means do I pretend to be some kind of expert, but common sense tells me with over 57 tributaries running into the Bad River, the impact to over 100 acres of wetland, and blasting south of the Reservation has a potential to affect our tribal waters and impact the Bad Rivers Clean Water Act. Unnatural disturbances planned to take place with the reroute has the potential to devastate or destroy the Bad River watershed. It's impossible to talk about the Clean Water Act on our land, fishing, water, trees, vegetation, and life. The river means life to our people. It's a place where we harvest fish, wild rice, and gather plants for medicine. The river allows us to spend quality time together with family members and friends. I enjoy fishing on a warm, sunny day and riding along down the river to the mouth to reach one of our favorite fishing spots on the main part of the Bad River to fish. At this time, we are still able to consume the walleye we catch based on the size of the fish containing mercury. If there is a substantial increase in mercury levels in fish due to unnatural disturbances, we may not be able to consume any fish. The biggest impact that threatens us is our way of life as Anishinaabe people. You ask us to not focus on these matters, but how can we not focus on the potential harm to our reservation and way of life? I too have lived on the reservation most of my life. I grew up a block or two from the river and learned at a very young age to respect the water. Maybe that was ingrained in us because water was hauled into our home every day for all the needs of the family. The Bad River holds several special places for tribal members, our past ancestors, and just this past weekend, a family member's ashes were spread out onto the Bad River at a special place cherished by her and our family. It's a place where we can revisit their loved ones, where her spirit and ashes were released. It allows for further healing and comfort to family members. For these reasons, we request a permit for Enbridge to proceed with the current planned reroute not be considered. Miigwech.
Bonjour, and I'm Chris McNerney, Water Resources Program Manager with the Mushkegee Natural Resources Department. I will be providing a brief overview of the Bad River Band and the band's water quality standards. The Bad River Band of Lake Superior Tribe of Chippewa Indians, seen here in orange on the map, is located in northern Wisconsin. The Bad River Reservation is over 124,000 acres in size, including almost 200 acres on Madeline Island. The Bad River Reservation signed 3 treaties with the United States and was created under the Treaty of 1854. The tribe and its members retained usufructuary rights under the treaties of 1837 and 1842 and continue to exercise their rights on the reservation and throughout the ceded territory, which includes lands in Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. The federal government has a fiduciary trust responsibility to the Bad River Tribe under these treaties. Bordering the shores of Lake Superior, the entire Bad River Reservation falls within the Lake Superior Basin. The reservation lies at the mouth of a large subbasin, draining a mostly forested rural area in Ashland and Iron counties of Wisconsin. She occupies a downstream portion of the USGS Bad River, Montreal, and Bear Trap Nemaji subbasins. The tribe and the state of Wisconsin have recognized the Bad River watershed as the watershed boundary, draining lands upstream of the mainland reservation, which includes the Bear Trap Creek subwatershed from the Bear Trap Nemaji subbasin. The Bad River Reservation is rich in water resources, with 38 miles of shoreline on Lake Superior, over 52,000 acres of mapped wetlands, 545 acres of lakes and ponds, and 488 miles of mapped intermittent and perennial streams. Madeline Island, located north of the reservation, has 2 miles of shoreline, 48 acres of mapped wetlands, and a 2-acre lake. The Bad River watershed is approximately 1,000 square miles, most of which drains through the Kakagan and Bad River sloughs. The watershed is a hydrologically connected wetland complex, and the mainland reservation sits on the downstream end. There are several main tributaries to the Bad River and the Kakagan rivers. The White, the Marengo, Tyler Forks, and Potato Rivers are the main tributaries to the Bad River. Bear Trap Creek is one of the several tributaries that is being crossed by the applicant's proposed project and is the main tributary to the Kakagan River. These waters are all within ceded territory and have been part of the band's homeland for centuries. The band is dependent on these surrounding waters to sustain the reservation. The Kakagan and Bad River sloughs are unique complex wetlands that provide abundant habitat for wild rice, a cornerstone of the band's culture and identity. The Kakagan and Bad River slough complex is one of the only remaining extensive coastal wild rice wetlands in the Great Lakes Basin. The sloughs complex comprises 13% of the coastal wetlands mapped within the entire Lake Superior Basin and comprises over half of the coastal wetlands mapped within the Wisconsin portion of the Lake Superior Basin. The sloughs complex has been designated as a Ramsar site, a wetland of international importance, and has received numerous other designations and recognitions, such as a national natural landmark, an important habitat area, a Wisconsin wetland gem, and a priority conservation area. Also, the US EPA has recently identified that the sloughs are an aquatic resource of natural importance. Many high quality and unique water resources exist within the surface waters of the Bad River Reservation and the Bad River watershed. These water resources perform important and irreplaceable functions within the Lake Superior watershed. In addition to numerous designations previously mentioned, the Kakagan Bad River Sloughs wetland complex contains critical habitats and supports a wide range of species, including wild rice and other unique species or species of special concern. The river is a cool water sport fishery important for spawning walleye and lake sturgeon, as well as supporting migratory runs of trout and salmon species. Along with only 2 other waterways in the Lake Superior Basin, the Bad River and White River support self-sustaining populations of lake sturgeon. There are also cold water streams and springs such as Tyler Forks River and the Potato River and other tributaries that support species like the coaster brook trout. These cold water streams will be affected by the construction activities of the applicant's proposed project. The water resources on the reservation support rare, threatened, and endangered species. Piping plover, seen here, is an endangered species nesting along the Lake Superior shoreline bordering the sloughs complex. Other species supported by the reservation waters include, but are not limited to, gray wolves, wood turtles, yellow rail, rougher red knot, mayfly species, ram's head lady slipper, and hooker's orchid. The reservation waters flow into Lake Superior, but also have the lake flow into them due to Lake Superior seiche, longshore currents, and other currents occurring in the Apostle Islands and Chequamegon Bay. Lake Superior's southern shore and tribal waters, as documented by the USGS, experience a SAISH effect from Lake Superior, which can carry water upstream at least as far as US Highway 2 along the Bad River. This is 5 river miles from the mouth of Lake Superior. Daily fluctuations in water levels occur in the Kakagan and Bad River sloughs due to SAISH. Depending on prevailing currents, water levels, and other seasonal factors, water from streams and rivers along the Bayfield Peninsula have been carried into the Chequamegon Bay and out into the Apostle Islands near Madeline Island. Apostle Islands are seen in the lower right-hand corner. You will also notice the picture on the left shows a portion of Chequamegon Bay on the left-hand side of that picture. And now the band's water quality standards. A brief overview. Since June 26, 2009, the band has had treatment as state authority pursuant to the Clean Water Act for the Water Quality Standards Program. EPA approved the band's water quality standards, which apply to all waters of the Bad River Reservation. The Bad River Tribal Council approved the water quality standards on July 6, 2011. The band's water quality standards consist of designated uses, narrative and numeric criteria to protect those uses, and anti-degradation provisions. Among other things, the band's water quality standards protects tribal members in the exercise of their treaty rights and the uses of water for subsistence purposes, health, and to maintain their cultural and spiritual identity and traditions. The earth is said to be a woman. She is called Mother Earth because from her come all living things. The Anishinaabe word for water is Nibit. Nibit is her life blood. Nibit flows through her, nourishes her, and purifies her. Nibit is a living, moving part of life that changes with its surrounding environment, connecting the past and the present with the fate of future generations. Nibit is life. Water bodies are assigned designated uses, which is a function of or activity in a water that is supported by a level of water quality. Cultural designated uses support essential water-based activities to maintain the tribe's cultural heritage. This includes, but not limited to, ceremony, subsistence fishing, hunting and harvesting activities. These activities are dependent upon healthy surface waters and biological communities. Wild rice, which is a cornerstone of the band's culture and identity, has a designated use to support or has the potential to support wild rice habitat for sustainable growth and safe consumption. Wetland areas that will be protected and maintained for biological diversity, provide recreational activities, preserve wildlife habitat, erosion control, groundwater recharge, stormwater retention, and the propagation of wild rice have a designated use of wetland. In the two bottom pictures, manumin, wild rice, the food that grows on the water, is being harvested in the sloughs wetland complex. There are other designated uses that protect wildlife, aquatic life, and fish, and cold and cool water fisheries. These protect organisms like the salamander pictured on the left, and protect the walleye and perch that are reared in the tribe's fish hatchery and released into the tribal waters, seen in the two photos on the right. In the next slides, I will discuss some of the narrative and numeric criteria in the tribe's water quality standards that help protect water bodies by identifying conditions or pollutant levels that support the designated uses. All waters within the reservation, including wetlands, shall be free from substances attributable from pollutant sources that produce objectionable turbidity, color, odor. All waters shall be free from substances that cause injury to, are toxic to, or produce adverse physiological responses to humans, animals, or plants. All water shall be free from pollutant sources that produce nutrients such as phosphorus and nitrates that stimulate algal growth, like the harmful algal blooms seen in the photos on the left. All waters within the reservation shall be free from substances that adversely affect the natural biological community of the water body. Some examples of these non-local beings are non-native cattail, purple loosestrife, and common buckthorn, and reed canary grass that outcompete native vegetation. Other narrative criteria are protective of the natural hydrological conditions that support all flora and fauna and prevent any adverse effects. Pollutants shall not be present that may cause or contribute to an adverse effect to humans, plants, animals, or aquatic life. These pollutants shall not be in quantities that may interfere with the growth and survival of indigenous aquatic biota. Water quantity and quality that of propagation of wild rice, wildlife, and other flora and fauna of cultural importance to the tribe shall be prohibited. Other natural causes, no measurable change in temperature that cause or contributes to an adverse effect to the natural biological community shall be allowed. Cold water trout streams, as seen in this picture, are sensitive to temperature changes and will affect aquatic life. Also, existing mineral quality shall not be altered by discharges that impair the designated uses for a water body. Numeric criteria like dissolved oxygen have daily minimum concentrations established for a water body capable of supporting aquatic life at 5 milligrams per liter. Waters designated as cold water fisheries shall have a daily minimum dissolved oxygen concentration of 6 milligrams per liter at any time and 8 milligrams per liter when and where early life stages of cold water fish occur. Turbidity is a measure of water clarity. High turbidity makes water appear cloudy or muddy. Turbidity increases as more sediments and other substances are released into the water. The numeric criteria for turbidity shall not exceed 5 nephelometric turbidity units, or NTU, over natural background when the background turbidity is 50 NTU or less. Or turbidity shall not increase more than 10% when the background turbidity is more than 50 NTU. Numeric criteria to protect aquatic life include, but are not limited to, pollutants such as arsenic, mercury, and selenium. Seen here are the chronic aquatic life criteria and acute aquatic life criteria that are not water characteristic dependent. Mercury is one of many pollutants with a numeric criteria to protect human health and applies to all waters with cultural and/or recreational designated uses. The Bad River community members harvest fish. In the pictures on the right, like walleye, vital to subsistence fishing. Numeric criteria protect wildlife and applies to all waters with wildlife designated use. Mercury is a pollutant with numeric criterion in this section. A young bald eagle is pictured on the right. Ammonia criteria, acute and chronic, are expressed as functions of temperature and pH, differ across sites, and differ over time within a site. Several equations are used to calculate the criterion maximum concentrations and criterion continuous concentrations. These equations are not listed. They are variable and based on presence or absence of fish early life stages and freshwater mussels. A lake sturgeon is pictured on the lower left-hand corner, and walleye early life stages are seen here in the pictures along with freshwater mussels in the lower right-hand corner. A key component of the band's water quality standards is the anti-degradation policy, which protects and ensures that all designated and existing uses are met and maintained for the 7th generation by providing the maintenance and protection of water quality. It prevents clean waters from being unnecessarily degraded and applies to all surface waters of the reservation. Water resources of the tribe are integral to its members' health, welfare, and economic security. Water resources which the tribe is dependent on provides cultural preservation and resources for consumption, subsistence, and sustainable economic development. The anti-degradation policy provides a framework for maintaining and protecting existing uses. Exceptional resource waters, or Tier 2, are of high quality and culturally important for the ecosystems they support. Outstanding resource waters, or Tier 2.5, are identified as high quality and culturally important to the tribe for the fisheries they support. No increased loads of bioaccumulative chemical of concern, BCC, are allowed in ORWs. Water is recognized as being largely pristine and important for cultivation of wild rice and have an exceptional ecological significance, are considered outstanding tribal water resources, or Tier 3 water. No new or increased discharges or alterations of the background conditions are allowed. The Bad River Water Quality Designation Maps is an interactive view of the water resources designation set in the anti-degradation policy and the band's water quality standards. This water quality designations map is available for public use. From this water quality designations map, we see Bear Trap Creek in the upper left-hand corner of the reservation. From there, traveling south, the White River and the Marengo River located in the southwest corner of the reservation. In the heart of the reservation is the Bad River, along with the Potato River and Tyler Forks seen here in the southeast corner of this map. These are some of the surface waters listed as ORWs and OTRWs that will be affected by the applicant's proposed project. Purple, in the northern portion of the mainland reservation, are the Kakagan and Bad River Slough complexes. As you can see from the water quality designations map, these vital wetland complexes are hydrologically connected to many surface waters on the reservation, including but not limited to Bear Trap Creek, the White River, and the Bad River. Miigwech.
All right, and your slide.
So, hi, good morning, everyone. I think it's good morning. My name is Esteban Chiriboga, and I'm an environmental specialist with the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, or GLIFWC for short. And I'm going to talk a bit about some recent mapping and analysis that we've done to support Bad River in this process. Just a quick background on my work. I have a master's degree in physical geography from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And one of my primary tasks has been to characterize the effects of large-scale land use alterations on natural resources that our member tribes depend on. I've been doing this for 27 years now. I use Geographic Information Systems, or GIS, as an important tool in my work. So, let's see. Oops. Can't advance the slide. Yeah, try that. Oh, okay. Good, it wasn't me. Okay. So just as a bit of background, GLIFWC is an intertribal agency of 11 Ojibwe tribes in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Our primary charge is to exercise delegated authority from those tribes to implement various federal court orders regarding the exercise of treaty reserve rights to hunt, fish, and gather in the ceded territories, which are the areas that you see on this map. As part of ensuring the continued existence of the treaty reserved rights, the health and sustainability of ecosystems must be protected and maintained. The Bad River Band is one of our member tribes, and the band and the proposed pipeline reroute are located in the 1842 ceded territory. The main purpose of the work that we did was to illustrate the hydrologic connections between the Bad River Reservation and the proposed Line 5 reroute footprint, and to characterize the adequacy of the hydrologic data that has been used in the analysis of impacts. And just as a disclaimer, all the data that you'll see today is public and is maintained by state and federal agencies. So establishing a hydrologic connection between the Bad River Reservation boundary, where the tribe's water quality standards apply, and the footprint of the proposed Line 5 reroute is relatively straightforward. This map illustrates the major rivers and streams down gradient of the proposed Line 5 reroute. The entire network that you see flows into Lake Superior, and the vast majority of that flow passes through the Bad River Reservation along the way. The potential impact area includes several streams that are classified as outstanding and exceptional resource waters by both state and tribal governments. These waters are connected across the reservation boundary, as you see, so there is an obvious regulatory connection that mirrors the hydrologic connection. The reroute is also located in close proximity to the reservation boundary, which means that any pollutants that are generated by pipeline construction and operation have very little time to be diluted before reaching the reservation boundary. And on this map, you can see some of the distances. Bond Creek, for example, is 4.9 miles, river miles from the reservation to the pipeline right of way. Potato River and Tyler Forks are 2.8 and 2.9 river miles, respectively. And the Brunsweiler River is about 2 miles upstream. And I'll be coming back to those 4 areas a bit later in this presentation. But the conceptual model that I think I'm going to talk about of hydrologic connectivity between a proposed landscape altering feature like the pipeline and a reservation boundary is something that this region of the core has already recognized and heard about. maybe some of your staff might recall that I gave a similar presentation to this a couple of years ago when the Fond du Lac band successfully chose North Met project. That challenge was based on the concept that contaminants from that mine would move through shallow groundwater and wetlands to headwater streams. And headwater streams are very important in hydrologic systems, even though they're small. The contaminants would then persist as water moved from these small headwater streams to the St. Louis River in northern Minnesota, all the while interacting with riparian wetlands to the Fond du Lac Reservation boundary some 80 river miles downstream. What I'm going to show and argue here similar activities that could lead to violation of Bad River Band's water quality standards being conducted immediately upstream of the reservation. And I will note that the St. Louis River and Bad River are both similarly sized rivers in Huckett watershed. So comparing the two, I think, makes sense. So evidence for hydrologic connections and the concern that activities in the headwaters can generate contaminants that move for large distances downstream are available in water quality samples. This map of the St. Louis River watershed, which the Corps has seen before, shows work that we did using Minnesota Pollution Control Agency specific conductance data. Specific conductance is a useful parameter because it measures the number of ions in the water. So it's a general measure of dissolved stuff in the water column. The large blue-green dots near the purple taconite mines in Minnesota represent water quality samples with higher specific conductance, and the dots get smaller with distance from the mines as the contaminant plume is diluted. This concentration and distance relationship for specific conductance is statistically significant. The dark blue dots on this graph are the samples for the St. Louis River, and the regression line indicates that this water quality signal, this impacted water quality signal, persists downstream for about 200 kilometers or 124 miles. So the point I think I'd like to make by showing this data is that distance from the reservation does not equate to compliance with water quality standards because contaminants can and do persist in the water column for fairly large distances. The land alterations caused by pipeline construction and operation will cause some changes in water quality, and the close proximity to the reservation means that there's little opportunity for dilution. Excuse me. So I think the hydrologic connectivity and the conceptual model of this transport of contaminants is established. Between the proposed Line 5 right-of-way and the reservation boundary. But it's important to note that initially used in defining the contaminant pathways considerably underestimates the magnitude of these hydrologic connections. Excuse me, my throat is very dry. So all of our agencies have used the available stream data sets maintained by the state or the National Hydrography Data Set, as well as wetland data from the Wisconsin Wetland Inventory. And these are the data sets we created on the first few maps I showed and on some of these figures up here. That hydraulic data was created through aerial photo interpretation and USGS quadrangle map use at a 1 to 24,000 scale. Now, the major flaw in this method is that it's difficult to impossible to visually identify wetlands and streams in forested environments because air photo, all you see is the tree canopy, right? And that's the majority of the area, as Chris mentioned, where the pipeline reroute would be sited. This map that you see here is a status map of areas where high resolution LiDAR-based hydrologic mapping has and continues to be done in the Bad River watershed. LiDAR-based mapping is far more accurate than air photo interpretation and is done at a 1 to 1,000 scale. Mapping in this section in black that you see here was completed in 2023, and earlier this year, mapping for the section in blue, just south of the reservation, was completed. The 2023 data was added to the National Wetland Inventory in 2023. The 2025 data should be added any day now. Comparing the 1 to 24,000 and 1 to 1,000 scale mapping is important for our conversation today. There was an increase in wetland acres across the entire Tyler Forks watershed with the new data. The yellow grids here show an increase of between 2.5 to 37 acres of wetland, and the blue boxes show an increase of between 148 to 222 acres of wetland. So with the LiDAR-based mapping, wetland acreage increased from a low of about 30% up to orders of magnitude more acres of wetland in this watershed. This shows, I think, that wetland acreage and therefore potential wetland impacts from construction and operation of Line 5 have been to date underestimated. Thank you. The same is true for LiDAR-based mapping completed earlier this year for the Upper Bad River watershed. Most of the area shows an increase in wetland area of up to 100 acres, and a few sections, including some close to the reservation, show 150 to 225 acres. I will note that there are 2 sections that actually showed a decline in wetland area, likely due to clearing and draining wetlands for agriculture. The LiDAR-based mapping also indicates significant increases in the length and density of stream networks, which confirms this long-stated position that Glifook and Bad River have had, that hydrologic connectivity between the proposed pipeline project and reservation boundary have been underestimated. Now, using the 2025 data, the increase in stream network is visually apparent just from looking at the lines here. But in terms of numbers, the older 1 to 24,000 scale hydrography had 270 river miles for this watershed. The newer data has 630 river miles, which is a 233% increase. That is not a small number. And most of that increase, just visually, are in these small streams south of the reservation boundary, but down gradient of where the proposed Line 5 pipeline would be located. Okay, so I'd like to try and zoom in on some areas to give some specific examples about how adequate hydrologic connectivity data highlights the likelihood of water quality violations of Bad River standards. So this first map is of the Vaughn Creek drainage on the eastern side of the reservation. The blue lines are the 1 to 24,000 scale hydrography, which we've all seen. The green areas are the Wisconsin Wetland Inventory that indicates a few areas of isolated wetland. The black and brown features are the areas of surface disturbance that would occur during pipeline construction. And earlier, I think the flow of water in these areas was described as being diffuse. And I think if you look at this data, you kind of support that kind of agrees with it. But when you look at the LiDAR-derived data, the picture is quite a bit different. The light blue lines are the LiDAR-derived streams, and the hydrologic network changes dramatically. Connections between the higher scale wetlands, now shown in yellow, that did not exist before, kind of obvious now. Because of surface disturbance for the Line 5 reroute and the reservation boundary are more adequately described. So for specific example, I'd like to kind of point you toward the little pink circle on the right side of the figure. If we look back, that area in the traditional Wisconsin wetland inventory was just a disconnected little piece of wetland. But when we look at the newer data, it is part now of a larger wetland complex that is connected by a stream to waters that flow directly to the reservation boundary. So moving south, we're now in the Potato River area, and the colors of the maps are going to be the same as what I had previously described. So again, we have some wetlands and a stream network, and I'll point you again to the area of the pink circle. Well, just above the pink circle, there's this kind of odd little stream that kind of is just a disconnected little piece of one there. And that's one of the things that often happens when you're trying to find streams based on air photo data. You can only see the parts that aren't covered by trees. When you look at the new LiDAR data, again, the wetlands are much better described, and the stream, that odd disconnected little piece of stream, is now in its proper place as part of a more complete description of the drainage network. And it does connect, again, an area of surface disturbance from the pipeline to the reservation boundary through this better described drainage network. Now, Tyler Forks. Again, this is the older data of Tyler Forks, and just move on to the new data. Wetland coverage is once again far better described. And I'd like to point towards two new stream segments that the LiDAR data identified, and I've marked them here as segments A, B, and CD. Stream AB directly connects an area of surface disturbance with the reservation boundary. That's only about 0.8 river miles away. Stream reach CD connects an area of surface disturbance with the Tyler Forks River itself. The length of that segment is 0.75 river miles. And again, these flow lines were not identified during previous impact analysis. The last example I'd like to show is the southwest corner of the reservation. And the colors are all the same. The older National Wetlands Inventory and Wisconsin Wetlands Inventory show a few disconnected wetlands. And once again, we'll kind of focus in on the little pink circle here. The newer LiDAR-derived data shows just a drastic increase in these smaller kind of headwater streams. I think it's a pretty dramatic visual. And the area of the pink circle is connecting some of these new drainages with, again, area of surface disturbance. This is also the part of the proposed pipeline that is closest to the reservation boundary. So I feel that it is an important area to focus on. But the other thing that I'd like to mention that this figure highlights is you can see in the aerial photo that there are more agricultural fields here. And a previous presentation really talked about the amounts of sediment that the Bad River does carry and other tributaries. But I think it was described as natural. That amount of sediment isn't a natural amount of sediment that is moving into the Bad River and these tributaries. It is a reflection of the fact that area that used to be forested has now been cleared to a large extent. And so the sediment pulses coming off these fields are greater than they would have been had this area still remained a forest. And so while it is the current condition, it's not a natural condition, and certainly not a condition that the band would say is conducive to their way of life or how they would, use the area. I think that is all. So I'd just like to conclude with a couple of statements. I think the far greater hydrologic connectivity between the proposed reroute and the reservation boundary is clearly apparent when one uses better and more accurate data. Without accurate hydrologic connectivity, the magnitude of the transport of contaminants from the proposed Line 5 that has been talked about already and will continue to be talked about for the rest of the hearing are underestimated. The impact analysis to date, therefore, has, I think, a high level of uncertainty, and any conclusions that regulatory agencies may draw that the project would not violate Bad River water quality standards are, in my view, not supportable. That is all I have. Again, I apologize, my voice is cracking, but I thank you very much for your time and your attention.
Next presentation lasts about 45 minutes. So I don't know if you want to go to lunch now.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Quick audio check with somebody from online.
Sir, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So this is the natural break that we'll use for lunch. We'll take 60 minutes for lunch, so we'll reconvene at 12:45 with further Bad River Band an hour from now. Thank you. Just get a quick audio check from online participants.
Your audio is good, sir.
I can hear you, sir.
Okay, thank you. Hey, look, we're back. We're gonna continue with the tribal verbal testimony in 1 minute. I just wanted to comment quickly on the slide issue we had earlier when the Enbridge presentation was going on. We have consolidated those slides. We'll post them on our publicly accessible website for those who could not clearly view them when they were being displayed. We apologize for that. And then also acknowledge that the chat feature was supposed to be disabled for this because it's all verbally collected testimony. However, it wasn't this morning. We do appreciate the fact that it wasn't because you were able to notify us of the slide issue, but it has been disabled since then. So the chat feature should not be accessible anymore. Just to make sure that we're adhering to the verbal component of it. And then those slides will be accessible on our publicly available website, all to see in detail. So I just want to make sure that everyone was tracking that. To the tribal, back to the band, and we're going to continue with our verbal testimony. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Commander Rudd and the Corps of Engineers for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Ian Payton. I'll be talking about the Line 5 reroute projects and hydrologic effects and water quality effects from the proposed project. Just a brief professional background. I'm a senior water resources engineer with Wright Water Engineers. I've been there about 25 years. My master's degree is in civil engineering from University of Colorado, Boulder. I'm a professional engineer registered in 3 states, including Wisconsin. I'm also a certified professional in erosion and sediment control, certified floodplain manager, experience in water resources and engineering related to hydrology, water quality modeling, erosion, sediment transport, the types of topics I'll be discussing today. I also have, in my experience, have observed hundreds of miles of pipelines, corridors, and the erosion and hydrologic effects from pipeline corridor construction. I'd also like to recognize my colleague, Natalie Collar. She's not here today, but she's a senior hydrologist at some of the modeling work that we'll be talking about today. She has her PhD in civil and environmental engineering from School of Mines. And she has over 12 years experience in water resources engineering, including disturbance hydrology, which was the subject of her PhD research, and numerous publications Natalie has, as well as statistical hydrology and the other topics that she has experience with there. So with that, I'll talk about the, first of all, the general focus of this evaluation. And the purpose of this evaluation to evaluate 3 main effects from the Line 5 reroute project. And I'll go through those briefly. First of all, the hydrologic effects from Line 5 reroute and land use changes that will occur as a result of the project. And will those land use changes alter the hydrology of water bodies where they flow onto the Bad River Reservation? Second main topic is water quality effects related to the Line 5 project and horizontal directional drilling inadvertent releases. And will the HDD IRs that I know have been discussed this morning from the Line 5 project have a reasonable potential to violate the water quality standards for increased turbidity, specifically for the Bad River Band? And finally, water quality effects related to Line 5 right-of-way erosion. And will erosion from that land disturbance along the right-of-way have reasonable potential to exceed Wisconsin DNR erosion thresholds, as well as water quality standards for the Bad River Band? So those are the 3 main topics I'll be talking about. We'll start with the first one, hydrologic effects. So the first, of course, when we're talking about changes in hydrology, the first thing to look at is the anticipated land use changes associated with the proposed project relevant to our evaluation. And this has been discussed today, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but the reroute, the right-of-way corridor, 41 miles long, 95 feet wide in wetland areas, 120 feet wide in upland areas, plus additional width for staging areas for HDD and equipment staging, things like that. The yellow rectangle there shown on the map, if we zoom in on that particular area on the southwest corner of the reservation, you can see the multiple numerous watersheds where they intersect the boundary of the Bad River Reservation, and also the footprint of the Line 5 corridor shown in light purple color there, and the close proximity of the pipeline right-of-way with the Bad River Reservation boundary. So of course, during the initial construction phase, there will be trees removed with heavy machinery, vegetation will be cleared. And as part of that, during ongoing maintenance, right-of-way brush will be cleared approximately every 5 years in accordance with PHMSA requirements for aerial observation of pipelines. And of course, that will limit the tree and shrub growth. It'll be more grassy, herbaceous vegetation or smaller vegetation versus the large tree canopy that exists now. What effects might the land use changes that we will observe on Line 5 have on the hydrology and sediment production and transport? So the current conditions along your proposed corridor, the vegetation is dense, mixed, deciduous, evergreen forest. I've had the opportunity to walk at many of the crossings and along the corridor surrounding the reservation. And so the effect of the project would be removing the dense vegetation will reduce the volume of precipitation intercepted by the forest canopy. And of course, this is common sense. When you stand under a tree under a rainstorm, you get protected from the rain. That rain is being held up in the tree canopy. So that's water that's not going to run off the watershed. And then the forest floor is covered with thick litter and duff layers, and it's that acts like a sponge. When rainfall it does make it to the forest floor, hits those thick litter and duff layers, it absorbs it and prevents it from running off. And so that's why you can have relatively large rainfall events in a forest and have very little runoff. And in the extreme condition would be a wildfire. And I realize we're not talking about wildfires today, but you lose that entirely the duff layer. You have that extreme runoff. So that's because of that storage. So removing that duff and litter layer will reduce the surface storage and surface roughness and increase soil erosion. And the surface roughness is also an important component because all the little pockets, if you walk out on that water on the right-of-way, all the little pockets and hummocks are little storage, little mini reservoirs along the right-of-way, especially in the wetland areas. And the contours, it doesn't provide the same abstraction or storage on the surface of the right-of-way corridor. In addition, the heavy machinery used for construction and maintenance will compact soils, which will reduce soil infiltration rates and increase runoff. Recognizing that scarification would happen afterwards where you roughen things up, you still have that soil compaction